Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why your memories sometimes feel a little fuzzy or even change over time, especially when you are comparing them to new things you see? Well, this new study might have a clue. This paper dives into how comparing something you remember with something you are seeing right now can actually change your memory. It sounds a bit like magic, but it is all about how our brains work. Imagine you remember what your friend's dog looks like, and then you see a dog that is really similar. That comparison can actually tweak your memory of your friend's dog. The researchers here were really curious about two big questions. First, does just one quick comparison really change your memory forever, or at least for a long time? And second, is the act of comparing what makes this change happen, or is it something else involved? So, our brains are constantly doing this comparing thing. It is actually super useful for us. It helps us know what is new and what is familiar, which helps us make quick decisions every single day. But the researchers point out that sometimes this comparing can mess with our memories. Think about eyewitness testimony. A person sees a crime, then later they pick someone out of a lineup. That act of picking someone, even if it is the wrong person, can actually change their memory of the perpetrator. They might become more sure about the wrong person later on. This is a big deal, and some experts even say the first time you try to identify someone is the only time your memory is truly reliable. In the lab, scientists have seen something similar with visual memories. When people compare their memory of an object with a similar-looking object, their memory report afterwards tends to drift towards that similar object. It is like the new thing pulls their memory towards it. And what is even more interesting is that this memory distortion can stick around even when people are tested again days later. This led to a big idea. Maybe the act of comparing is the key ingredient that makes these memory distortions last, but the researchers wanted to dig deeper. They thought, are there any hidden assumptions here? The first assumption they wanted to check was whether performing a comparison is absolutely necessary for this long-lasting memory change. They knew that other things, like just seeing a similar object without actively comparing it, can also cause some memory changes. But they hadn't really tested if these smaller changes could last for a long time. They wondered if maybe it is not just the comparison, but how you pay attention to things that really matters. If something grabs your attention, even if you are not explicitly comparing it, could that also lead to lasting memory issues? The second assumption they questioned was whether a single comparison is enough to cause a lasting change. In many past studies, the memory distortion was measured right after the comparison, and then again later. But the act of reporting your memory right after the comparison might also add to the distortion. It is like if you are asked to draw something you just saw, and then you have to draw it again later. The first drawing itself might introduce changes. So, they wanted to see if a memory distortion could persist even if you didn't report your memory right after that initial interaction. To address these theoretical gaps, we conducted 3 multi-session experiments where we manipulated attention to similar visual inputs and the demands for immediate memory reports. Saito to figure this all out. They designed 3 experiments. The main idea was to test different situations. They had people learn a bunch of colored objects. Then, on the same day and again 24 hours later, they tested their memory. The clever part was what they did after the person recalled an object from memory. They would show them a similar-looking object, a probe, and they would change what the participants had to do with that probe. In each experiment, we asked observers to encode colored object silhouettes into their LTM in anticipation of immediate IE. Same session as encoding and delayed, i.e. 24 hours after encoding memory testing. In the first experiment, one group of participants had to actively compare the probe's color to their memory. Another group was told to just ignore the probe. This was to see if just passively seeing something similar could cause lasting memory issues. Scroll out the RST test following cued recall. The silhouette was presented again in a similar color to serve as a perceptual probe to be compared with memory or to be used in a control task, where comparisons were omitted and attention to the probe varied across experiments. In the second experiment. They made the control task more demanding. Instead of just ignoring the probe, participants had to do a rapid task with letters that were shown on top of the probe. This was to see if having to pay attention to something else while a similar-looking object was present would cause lasting memory changes. Scroll in experiment 2. We increased the strength of perceptual distraction to determine whether bias persistence could be explained by the need to shift attention away from memory during comparisons, rather than the act of comparison. Per SEC then, in the third experiment, they tried to make the control task as similar as possible to the actual comparison task in terms of how much attention was needed. Participants had to look at the probe's color and decide if it was warm or cold. This required them to focus on the color and make a judgment, just like in the comparison task. Scroll in experiment 3. We attempted to maximally equate the attentional demands between our control task and comparisons by asking observers to attend to the color of the probe and categorize its color as warm or cold. And importantly, in all these experiments, sometimes participants had to report their memory right after the probe task, and sometimes they didn't. This was crucial for testing, if the initial memory report itself was needed for the distortions to stick around. Scrollbo found attractive biases in observers' memory reports at the immediate test following weak distraction, both forms of strong distraction and perceptual comparisons. Consistent with previous literature, NC Cell. So what did they find? Well, across all the different conditions, when people saw a probe that was similar to what they remembered, their memory reports tended to shift towards that probe, especially when they had to do something that involved paying attention to the probe. This confirmed what other studies have shown, that seeing similar things can mess with our memories. While biases persisted into the second test following comparisons, as previously demonstrated, they also persisted when the control task required processing of the probe that was commensurate with comparisons in cell. But the really groundbreaking stuff came when they looked at the persistence of these memory distortions. They found that yes, distortions caused by making an actual comparison stuck around for 24 hours. This was expected, but here is the kicker. Distortions also stuck around when people just had to categorize the probe's color as warm or cold. And even more surprisingly, these distortions persisted even if the participants didn't report their memory right after the initial interaction. Therefore, a single perceptual comparison is indeed sufficient for memory distortions to persist, but persistence may be primarily determined by attentional engagement with similar visual inputs. This told them two main things. First, it seems like a single instance of comparing something you remember with something you see is indeed enough to cause a memory distortion that lasts. You don't need repeated exposures or a whole lot of conscious effort. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it is not just the act of comparing that is the magic ingredient. It seems to be the attentional engagement with similar visual information. When your attention is drawn to something similar, whether you are comparing it, categorizing it, or even just trying to ignore it while something else is happening, that engagement seems to be what drives the lasting change. The present study clearly demonstrates that explicit memory reports do not play a necessary role in the persistence of report biases across time. This also means that the idea that you absolutely need to make a memory report right after seeing something similar for the distortion to stick around isn't quite right. The memory change can happen just from the interaction with the visual input itself, before you even get a chance to report it. The present endings also motivate important questions regarding the nature of the biases that were reported. The researchers also discussed how these distortions happen. Is it that you are actually misremembering the original item, or is it that you are blending the memory of the original item with the new visual input? They suggest it is likely a bit of both. Your memory gets pulled towards the new information. But it might also be that you are misattributing the features of the new thing to your original memory. What is it about comparisons and category judgments that make it more likely for the resulting distortions to persist from one retrieval episode to the next? Why does this attentional engagement make distortions so sticky? The paper explains that when you pay attention to similar visual information, it is like you are strengthening that new information in your brain, and it gets integrated with your existing memory. This integration process, especially when your attention is actively involved, seems to make the memory more robust against forgetting, but in a distorted way. It is like your brain is trying to make sense of the new information and updating the old memory to include it, even if that update isn't perfectly accurate. Maladaptive interference or rational integration. The paper also touches on whether these distortions are really bad or if there is an adaptive reason for them. Some argue that these distortions are just errors, like a glitch in the system, but others propose that they might be a form of rational integration. Think about how things in the real world often change gradually. Our brains might be using this incoming information to make better guesses about the world, even if it means slightly distorting our memories. It is like our brains are constantly trying to predict what is next based on what is happening now. Scrollfeasning suggests that performing a single perceptual comparison is indeed sufficient to produce a lasting memory distortion, and reveal that this lasting innuance is primarily explained by attentional engagement with similar visual inputs rather than the act of comparison per SE time. Overall, this study gives us a really clear picture. A single comparison can indeed lead to lasting memory distortions. But it's not just the comparison itself, it's the level of attention you give to that new similar visual input that truly matters for making those distortions stick around. This has implications for how we think about learning, remembering, and even how reliable our memories are in the first place. It suggests that being mindful of what we're paying attention to, especially when it is similar to things we already know, is super important for keeping our memories accurate. It is fascinating to see how flexible and changeable our memories can be, and how much of it is tied to simple things like our attention. This research highlights how complex our memory systems are and how much more we have to learn. If you found this deep dive into memory distortions as interesting as I did, please hit that like button. Let me know in the comments what surprised you the most about this study, or if you have any personal experiences with your memories changing. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating insights into the human mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.